Welcome to Admissions Live, the weekly web show for college admissions professionals. I'm your host, Ashley Hennigan. I'm live with Jeff Selingo tonight. We're part of the Higher Ed Live network, where we're dedicated to digital development and professional empowerment. Again, tonight's guest is Jeff Selingo. You can tell how excited I am. I can hardly speak. Editor-at-large at the Chronicle of Higher Education. If you're following along with us live tonight, we encourage you to share your thoughts and questions using the Admissions Live hashtag on Twitter. You can tweet directly to myself at Ashley Hen or at Higher Ed Live, or to our guest at J Selingo. So I am thrilled to be speaking with Jeff tonight about his insights into the value gap in higher education, and I want to get right to the show, but you know I can't do that without first thanking the sponsors that make Admissions Live possible. And Admissions Live is sponsored by Welcome to College, who believe it's all in the visit, and who have created web and mobile applications to help institutions measure and manage their most critical recruitment tool, the college visit. Visit welcometocollege.com to learn more, or tweet at Welcome to College for a demo. Admissions Live is sponsored by Zinch, the preferred destination by over 3 million students to research schools and scholarships and to showcase themselves as more than a test score. Over 1,000 colleges and universities around the world partner with Zinch to attract and enroll best fit students on the largest college search social network in the world. To learn more about Zinch, email outreach@zinch.com or tweet at socialadmission. Admissions Live is sponsored by Integral, the creators of the Schools app on Facebook. While 100% of colleges are using social media to engage prospective, admitted, and current students, only 1/3 of enrollment managers are happy with their metrics and results. Learn about social enrollment management during Integral's upcoming webinar tomorrow, December 5th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and we just sent out a tweet with the link to register for that. And last but not least, Admissions Live is sponsored by Scavenger, a Google-funded mobile game about going places, doing challenges, and earning points. Learn how your institution can get started with Scavenger, as well as read case studies and interviews with some of the 400 colleges and universities who have already used their service at scavengeru.com. Tonight's guest is editor, speaker, author, and futurist Jeff Selingo. Jeff is currently editor-at-large at the Chronicle of Higher Education and has spent more than 15 years reporting on higher ed trends. I had the pleasure of meeting Jeff at the New York State ACAC annual meeting, and I'm so pleased to have him here with me tonight. So without further ado, I would like to bring Jeff on camera. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Ashley.
How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing well. It's nice and warm down here in Washington, which is obviously very unusual for December. So.
And strangely warm here as well. I really thought I saw snow on cars, but it was rain. So my eyes are tricking me. Let's get started. I want to talk a little bit about your background first. And you have degrees in journalism and government, so it's not surprising that you made it to Washington. Can you tell me how you got involved writing about higher ed and what would eventually lead you to your role at the Chronicle?
Well, I actually got started writing about higher ed at Ithaca College up there in upstate New York. Yeah. Not as far upstate as you, but no. I was editor of the student newspaper at Ithaca at a time when higher education, this was early 90s, at a time when higher education was going through similar issues that it's going through now. Obviously not technology, but there was a demographic bust in the early 1990s, and Ithaca, like a number of other schools, was dealing with some issues with declining student enrollments. And so it was actually just kind of an interesting time as a journalist to be dealing with the issues surrounding that. And so always had an interest, took a detour through Arizona and North Carolina, covering technology and the environment, obviously somewhat unrelated and related to higher ed, and then ended up in the late 90s at the Chronicle as a reporter. Moved through the ranks there, covering state politics and editing our government coverage. But most of my time was spent in the early years as a reporter for the Chronicle, covering public and private universities in various states. So it was a terrific job. I got to parachute in on college campuses, probably visited almost probably 30, 40 states during that time, and talked to presidents, governors, faculty members, students. It's one of the best jobs at the Chronicle covering the states. But eventually, I wanted to sit in an office, and that's what I did, and did that as editor. I was the top editor for 4 years, and stepped back from that role last year to really focus on the future of higher education.
Excellent. So you've, like you said, most recently taken this role as editor at large, and you've been speaking and writing about higher ed in a way that so many of us have now been able to start thinking differently about some of the trends that we're seeing. So for our viewers that might not be familiar with your writing, I want to pause and read a few of your recent titles. The Fiscal Cliff of Higher Education, Skills Gap, Employers and colleges point fingers at each other. Is more competition really good for higher education? College presidents on value, tone deaf, or lacking confidence? The uneven value of academic credit, and just posted today, Money Matters, can you truly calculate the return on the college investment? So there's some strong common themes in here about finances and value and outcomes. Is there something that's really inspired you to kind of hit hard on these trends?
Well, I think it's just the increasing cost of college, and obviously, whenever I go to a party here or some other event here in Washington, and somebody knows I work at the Chronicle, the first question I always get asked is, why does college cost so much? But in more recent months, and even in the last year or so, it was more about, okay, what am I buying with what I'm spending? I think I've come to a point in this country where we know higher education is worth it. But the idea that we are willing to spend anything to go anywhere is no longer the case. And I think that parents and students more often today are saying, what am I getting in return for what I'm spending? And that doesn't necessarily have to be a financial return at the end of the day. I think people sometimes misunderstand me when I'm talking about this. It's not all about that job and that paycheck, but it's really about, is the college going to provide me the experience and the academic rigor that will serve me well in the workforce and in life over the course of my life?
Yeah, and I do want to thank you for moving the conversation beyond that mainstream favorite question, is college worth it? And making us look a little bit deeper at the issues that Americans should be asking in the first place. Right. Yes. And we do see,
but this not to I mean, there is the New York Times over the weekend wrote another one of these stories. Should you go to college? Should you use that money to do a startup company in Silicon Valley? And what's unfortunate about those stories is that I think those stories are aimed at incredibly smart, incredibly wealthy students who could kind of do anything in life. And for the most part, I grew up in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Kids there to really kind of get out of the lower classes in the U.S. I mean, really the only ticket to the middle and upper classes in the U.S. and social mobility is a college education.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you've been speaking around the country about the future, what the future college looks like, the jobs of tomorrow, what they look like, the coming disruption in higher education. And I did have the pleasure of hearing your keynote this summer at your alma mater in Ithaca at that New York State ACAC annual meeting. That setting was so beautiful. It must have been a special event for you to be able to go back and speak there at Ithaca. But in your talk, you centered it around the value gap, and that's something that I hope that you would share tonight. And so if you could kind of help us understand this value discrepancy, because that was presented to me in a way that I hadn't heard before. So can you kind of define what that is and why it's so important to us, particularly those of us in enrollment, and why we need to understand this?
So increasingly what's happening, and this is based on surveys that the Chronicle took with the Pew Research Center 2 years ago, and actually, without even knowing it, a survey that Time Magazine and the Carnegie Foundation just took a couple of weeks ago, or actually just released a couple of weeks ago. And you see the same results in both cases, where we asked Americans and where we asked college presidents about the value of higher education, not the cost. But really about what's the value of the American higher education system for the money people are spending. And in both surveys, you saw this similar gap between what presidents think and what the public thinks. And Americans are actually getting more negative on this. So they think, more than 50% of Americans think that higher education is a fair or good value for the money spent. Just barely over 50%. But college presidents, about 3/4 of them think it's an excellent or terrific value. So you have the people running the institutions who think that they are providing a great value for the money Americans are spending on their institutions, while the people, the customers, and I know a lot of people in higher ed hate that word, but the customers think, wait a second, I'm not really getting out of this what I'm paying. And in the survey that we did with Pew, the most negative responses actually came from recent college graduates, especially ones who were deep in debt and were not making a lot of money in their first jobs after college. They were really questioning the value of their degree. And maybe value does increase over the course of your lifetime as you look back upon what a college provided. But I don't think that colleges, and especially presidents, who I've said on a number of occasions are kind of tone deaf to what Americans think about this. I don't think they're just saying, yeah, we're worth it. Trust us. We provide you a great experience, but they're not providing the details and the evidence to show that quality learning is going out on there, that the outcomes are great. Everybody talks about the famous alums that graduate. I can name the 10 famous alums that graduated from Ithaca College because I hear about them all the time. But how about everybody else? What is everyone else doing? What is everyone doing a year out of college, 5 years out of college, and 10 years out of college? And you know what? If colleges don't do this, others are going to fill this gap. They already are.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a couple of really good points in there that I want to dig a little bit deeper into. And we're talking about the naysayers that, this isn't the case. And, and we see that not just with value, but all of the other factors that are kind of hitting higher ed right now and changing what's happening. You see these naysayers at every point that's made, saying it's fine, we're going to keep doing what we've been doing. This isn't affecting us. And you've had such a close relationship with how things can change in an industry. And that's something that you presented to us at Ithaca as well. So how do we combat these naysayers, because they're on every college campus, and I won't say what departments they're in, but but how do we kind of open their eyes to this realization?
Well, I think a lot of this actually is about communications. I just did a presentation at the American Marketing Association meeting down in New Orleans, and some of the feedback I heard on Twitter and talking to folks afterwards is that my message was fairly negative. And it is. I mean, to me, it's more of a challenging message, right? But I actually see a lot of positives in higher ed, and I think a lot of institutions have this value on campus. They're just not communicating it well to students in some cases, or they're not collecting the right amount of data or the right data and communicating that to students. So I could talk a little bit about that later, like what are the types of things that I think institutions need to be communicating to students. But in terms of the naysayers, you know what? There's always going to be a group on campus that you never get, right? There's the people who are always with you. There's probably 25% of them, 25% who will never agree with you no matter what you do. And there's that vast middle that's incredibly important. And I think that over time, they believe in evidence. And so not just presenting them with anecdotes, but presenting them with surveys such as this and other surveys, because at the end of the day, it's going to be the students in the pipeline. I've spent a lot of time over the last year talking to middle school students and early high school students. It's those students that are going to push colleges to change. because they want different experiences. They want to learn in different ways. They want to cobble together their degree in different ways. And by the way, they're the ones, and in some cases their parents are the ones going deep into debt in some cases. And they want to make sure, you know what, I'm willing to spend this money, but I want to make sure at the end of the day that I'm getting a worthwhile experience.
Yeah, so let me ask you about that, because I see that too as a counselor out on the road talking to these students day in and day out. And there are the students that are focused on outcome, graduation rate, and where are your students placed. And I think even, some of the great data that's coming out of LinkedIn right now, I'm kind of throwing people that way because my institution looks is right in line with our brand if you go out and look at our alumni on LinkedIn. So outcomes, I think, is a piece that they can grasp, but the academic rigor part that you speak about, I tend to think that the high school students don't really know what they're getting themselves into in college. So for them to understand what to even look for, what kind of pieces should they be looking for? What is rigorous? How does that rigor translate into the real world? I think that's a big thing for a high school student to try to fold into their college search and understand. So do you find that to be true? And is there a way that we can, as an industry, better articulate what we're providing?
Well, and I think that's the issue. I mean, so when I spoke at New Orleans and recently, somebody said to me, well, are high school kids really interested in academic rigor? They really want to go to the easiest place and get an A and move on. And I said, well, for those students, by the way, they're going to go to the cheapest institution. If all they're interested in is the credential, if they're interested in getting in, getting out, and getting that credential and getting a job, and they want to make it the easiest possible route, they're not going to go to an expensive institution to get that, right? They're going to go, if their goal is the credential, they're going to go to the cheapest institution. So in terms of what to sell, I think that for those students who you can prove that, hey, we're going to give you a great rigorous experience here that will prepare you well for the workforce, not just for your first job, but for your fifth job. And talking not only about the majors you offer, but the types of classroom experiences that you have. I talk a lot in my forthcoming book about majors of the future, and I actually discourage people from trying to read the tea leaves and think about, what are the jobs going to be in 10 years and pick a major. I actually talk to them about getting certain kinds of experiences, getting to know, not only taking great classes, but finding great professors. So that professor-student relationship that I think so many colleges talk about internally, but never really talk about that or exhibit that externally to parents and students. We all know from our own college experiences, great professors we had. We still sometimes talk about those people. Let's illustrate that more. Let's tell stories more about that. Undergraduate research, a lot of, project-based learning is happening, whether it's service learning or research projects, even as early as the freshman year. Start talking more about those projects and the skills that students are learning in those classes, whether it's working in teams, writing, public speaking, the skills that employers tell us increasingly they want in students. Study abroad. More and more institutions are focused on getting more students abroad, not necessarily for a semester, but even for short periods of time. And, and again, it's something employers want in students. They want kind of a global perspective. And I think that if institutions start talking more about those things, and less about, to be honest with you, and I hate to pick on it, but the climbing wall and the sushi in the dining hall and the great dormitories, or sorry, residence halls. The Chronicle doesn't call them residence halls. I think that parents and students would appreciate that. It's refreshing. To me, this is about the narrative. This is about the narrative about why you and
looks like
they seem very similar to an outsider.
Looks like you froze on us for just a second there, but we got you back. No, it's okay. So it was one of the things that I saw on the back channel from AMA. I wasn't there, but I was following along, and that was one of the kind of biggest takeaways that I think other people at that conference had from the conference as a whole, was that it's not good enough just to say that we're hands-on anymore, that everyone is hands-on. What is that experience? What are you delivering? And I really appreciate the point that you make about faculty, because I don't think faculty stories and even just faculty biographies are showcased in our literature, on our websites, like they should be. Some places you can't find anything on faculty. Sometimes you get a name and maybe an email address and phone number, but you really don't have the depth that you could have. What are they writing? What's their background? Where are their degrees from? All of those kinds of things are really easy for departments to put together. And then faculty, I'm sure, would like to have that information out there too. So that's, it could be a larger project, but in the grand scheme of things, that's a pretty easy thing for us to do and promote and think about. So I appreciate that answer, because I think we have a really good grasp on our outcomes for our students. And I think students, prospective students, can also kind of envision where they might be afterwards, but what they're actually doing during college is kind of this mysterious thing until you get there and really understand what it is. So I do want to reach out to any viewers. If you have questions, certainly send them our way. But I do want to ask you to talk about one more thing that really stood out for me and kind of still stands out for me from your presentation. And that's the piece about debt, and not student debt. So the statistic that you showed that kind of, keeps me up at night was the amount of debt that our colleges and universities are in. And it's staggering, and yet we still continue to only focus on this student debt crisis. So can you share some of your insights to that?
So I actually don't know the total number offhand, but basically since 2000, the amount of institutional debt, the amount of debt that institutions have taken on to build buildings and do other things has grown, almost doubled between 2000 and in 2010. And institutions took on that debt to build everything from new academic buildings to new residence halls to upgrade facilities. And they did that on the thought that interest rates were low, so that helped them a little bit. But they did that on the thought that money would continue to come in as it always has. And then the recession hit in 2008. And as you know, and many of your colleagues know, institutions across the country, particularly privates and even publics, have been spending more and more of their budgets on institutional aid, on financial aid. And so what we're seeing now is the growth in revenue is actually, I think it's at 60% of colleges now have either seen flat or declining net tuition revenue in the last couple of years. And that's real cash, right? That's real cash that is used to pay employees and to do other things on campus, but it's also cash, by the way, that you use to pay down your debt. And so where I worry is that so institutions have taken on this massive amount of debt, thinking that the admissions channel that they've always had will continue on forever. And I think we're already seeing either institutions not making their classes or having to increase their discount rate to make their classes. So, and all that, of course, affects the bottom line. And also, I was just talking to somebody last week about the issue of deferred maintenance. And so we've built up these campuses in a way that we're about to see in the next 10 years a huge deferred maintenance bill come due, and in some cases it's already due on campuses. At the same time, by the way, you want to continue to build the latest infrastructure. Sure. We haven't even talked a little bit about technology, but this idea of smart classrooms, hybrid education requires these Cisco telepresence rooms, which I've seen on some college campuses. I mean, that's $500,000. From what I know, it's $500,000 to build one of those. Yep. And I can imagine the technology will change in 2 years, and they'll have to spend another $500,000 to upgrade it. So this is a big issue, and I think that in some ways I don't blame colleges for spending that money, but they spent that money thinking the good times would last forever, and they haven't.
Yeah, and a lot of our campuses are resort locations for students to spend their next 4 years. And if you think about it that way, then it is a deal, right?
It is, and the point I always make on this, Ashley, is that it's not that I don't want college to be fun. By the way, it should be, right? It's a great time in a person's life. But my feeling is, if Harvard tomorrow replaced all of its beautiful residence halls with jail cells, I have a feeling that students would still go to Harvard. And so, I have a number of presidents who come through my office and say, we have to keep up with the Joneses because that's what parents and students want. And I say, yeah, but you have to keep up with the level that you all complain, by the way. They all complain about keeping up with the Joneses. I mean, if you're offering such a great academic experience, don't you think some people might say, you know what, this is going to prove of such a value to my life in the next 20, 30, 40 years. I'm willing to live a little less for the next 4 years. I could do without that private bathroom or whatever. And I think, again, if schools are selling the academic experience, I don't think they're going to have a negative outcome on admissions, as many of them I think they would.
Right. So let's turn to a couple questions. First question. Are there institutions that are positioned well to offer the value proposition that students are looking for?
Yes. So I think that those institutions...
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Ashley.
Generally speaking.
Yeah, generally you don't want specific examples, right?
I don't think so.
Okay. Yes. So I think on two fronts. I think that institutions that are, if you think about the work that George Q has done in his colleagues at Indiana on high impact learning practices. I mean, there are 10 practices well known, everything from, getting to know a professor your freshman year, the capstone experiences, the living learning communities, the service learning, study abroad, and so forth. I think those institutions that are able to illustrate how they do that and how they do that throughout the curriculum are well positioned as opposed to other institutions. And in terms of the outcomes, we haven't talked much about that, but there are a couple of institutions, just a handful right now, but I think they're increasing. And to be honest with you, the group that is leading on this front is a group of colleges most people don't think about in terms of leading on connecting education and the workforce, and that's the liberal arts colleges. I think the liberal arts colleges feel a little under pressure right now to prove their value, and several of them are doing a really good job on connecting students to what the outcomes will be in the workforce. So they're showing students, for example, what is the class of 2011 doing? And really good detailed information about the types of places they're working, in some cases salaries, and they're really making those deep connections between what does a degree in English mean and what can you do with it a year out, 5 years out, 10 years out. I give a lot of credit to many of the liberal arts colleges that are thinking very strategically about this.
So you started to talk a little bit about outcome.
Yeah.
Let's talk more about that. And I don't know if there was a certain direction you wanted to go with it, but in my mind, I think about outcomes that we don't know exist for these students yet. And that piece of it that is really hard to articulate to a student. And in my institution, we have a lot of very career-focused degrees for very specific industries that did not exist 5-10 years ago, and degrees that did not exist 5-10 years ago. So that is another complicated piece for our industry to kind of take hold of.
Yes, I'm not a huge fan of all those new degree programs that have increased. I think a lot of it is basically takes a lot of existing courses and repackages them and gives them away as new degrees. But really, where I think that colleges and universities need to focus is on this employment question. And we're already seeing this at the law school level. The reason some law schools, by the way, have been sued is because because students didn't believe their job placement numbers, and in fact, in some cases, colleges were puffing them. They were increasing them by various methods. And when I look at the job placement numbers for most colleges, to be honest with you, I'm not quite sure I believe them. I mean, most of them are, 91% of the class of 2012 is placed in a job in 6 months after, and we know those are based on surveys that only about 30% of students actually respond to, or graduates respond to. I think that most of the people responding to them probably are already employed. We also don't know, are they employed at Starbucks as a barista, or are they actually in their career? And no offense against the baristas at Starbucks. I think they're terrific because they prepare my peppermint mocha around this time of year, so I appreciate them. But at the same time, I think that parents and students want to know, what are the types of jobs I'm going to get? And, and I shared with the folks when I was up in Ithaca in June, these databases that several states now have available. And in Virginia, Tennessee, and Arkansas now have databases that allow parents and students to look at the first year salaries of graduates by program and by institution. And these are real numbers, by the way. They're basically linking together the unemployment insurance records in the state with the graduation records in the state. And so you can see what business majors at George Mason University make in their first year.
Yeah, and that's really incredible.
And those are powerful numbers.
Mm-hmm. It really is. And I think when you presented, Virginia had just implemented that, just kind of made that public. So how has that kind of played out in the past 6 months? Good feedback, bad feedback, I'm sure a little bit of both and from different constituencies, but do you see that as a trend that's going to keep unfolding?
Oh, I definitely think it's going to be a trend. I have a feeling that when lawmakers, I think this is a big issue for state lawmakers, particularly on the public side. Now, most private universities are captured in these data. And I think that when lawmakers in other states see these databases, they're going to say, we want to do this in our state too, because it shows the payback of particular institutions as opposed to others. And in Virginia, for example, I just moderated a discussion about this last week, and there's been some negative feedback by the institutions, particularly that don't do well.
Sure.
In some cases, community colleges, the payback from the first year payback from an associate's degree at a community college is actually better than a bachelor's degree at other places. And I think these numbers, I'm not saying that students and parents should make all of their decisions on first year salary or on salaries at all. We already have this, by the way, at pay scale, so it's not like any of this is a big secret. But I think this is incredibly important at a time when student debt is increasing. So we know, for example, that the average debt of a bachelor's degree recipient in this country is around $26,000 or so. And if you're going to take on that debt or whatever debt you might take on at your institution, I think you should know, hey, what is the success of these of the graduates of this institution? What is last year's class making in my major? I think that's one piece of the puzzle that students and prospective students and parents should consider. Not all of it, but I think it's definitely one piece.
I agree, and I think that's fair. I do want to take one more question from Twitter before we talk about College Unbound. And the question is regards to college spending. Have you noticed more of college spending focused on PR efforts? And do you think that's a good thing? It seems like this person might have an idea that there has been an increased spending for PR.
I'm actually looking at Twitter, so I know who's asking this question.
Good.
But anyway, so I actually had a president in my office yesterday who claims that they've cut spending on public relations and communications drastically. But I also know that they still spend a decent amount on it. And we're seeing this. And in some cases, I don't blame institutions. I work in the news media that has been decimated over the last decade by job cuts. There are fewer reporters out there covering higher education, especially in the smaller communities, but even at places like the New York Times. And I think institutions feel like they have to get their message out directly to the public. I'm sorry that has happened. I mean, I really wish that newspapers and magazines and others have continued to convey that message. And so I do think there has been an increase. And I see it. I get bombarded with press releases and phone calls from PR folks at colleges, universities who all I think are doing a great job. I think they've been kind of forced to do it though because of the cuts in the newspapers.
Yeah, that's a good insight. So I appreciate that. Let's talk about College Unbound before we wrap up. And what can we expect when this hits shelves and our e-readers this May?
Well, I hope that everybody buys it. That's my commercial.
Yes.
Already for pre-sale on Amazon.com. What can we expect? I think this is a book really aimed at parents and students. Really, I had a difficulty trying to figure out the exact audience for this, but I'm really aiming it at I guess what today we would call non-traditional parents and students. I'm really aiming it at the high school market and parents there as well. But I think I've had a number of college presidents read drafts of it, and many of them told me that they hope that their boards and faculty members and other professionals in higher ed would also read it. And I think what you should expect is I kind of take you on a tour of how we got to this point. The lost decade, which I talked about in Ithaca, this decade between 99 and 2009, when I think higher ed really could have gotten its house in order to prepare for what's ahead. Then I talk about the disruption that's we're undergoing right now with technology, whether it's personalized learning or whether it's the MOOCs, which seem to be on the front page of the New York Times every other day. And then I talk about what I think the future will be, and that's an unbound future. It's a disaggregated future where students will, I think, be less brand loyal in higher education, and they will get their education by different institutions, by different providers that are not even things we think of as traditional institutions. They'll want to move around a lot, and whether getting that experience on a job or an internship or in another country. And then at some point, somebody will bind all that together, will cobble that all together and certify that as a learning experience. And I think the institutions that get ahead of this, and I think a number of institutions are already doing that, the institutions that get ahead of this and figure out, how can we bring in students through different pathways and not just the pathway we always thought of as graduate from high school in June, bring them in September, a couple of months later. I think the pathways to college will only increase in the next decade, and institutions that figure out how to capture those students at different parts of the life cycle, I think will be the ones that will survive and thrive in the next 10 years.
Great. Well, that piece enough is, even if it's not geared towards higher education professionals, that piece enough should be reason to pick it up. But as a final note for our future readers and our viewers tonight, I'd like to ask one last question. With College Unbound, you've created this resource for prospective students and families, but what do you hope that us who are recruiting these prospective students and their families are going to be able to take away from it?
I'm not quite sure you'll like it at all points. As I was telling you earlier, I have a checklist for students at the end that suggests they ask a lot more questions during the college search process, questions I don't think they're necessarily asking right now. I think the college search process, particularly the financial aid process, I think is very uneven right now. I think it really favors the institution. I think the institution knows a lot more about the student, both their academics and their finances, than the student knows about the institution. Students are somewhat to blame for that. I'm not letting them off the hook here, but I really hope that I empower students and families through this book to really realize what they're buying, what they're getting, and to ask the right questions. And I think the institutions that are ahead of the game and being not only honest, I'm not saying the institutions are dishonest, but honest with students and really giving them the experience that they deserve for the price they're paying, I think will do very well over this next decade or two. It's the institutions that I don't think have that narrative down. Yep. To tell me why here and not there. Why should I go to your institution, not the other institution? They look like everyone else. They feel like everyone else. I think those are the institutions that are going to be in real trouble in the next couple of years.
Great. So in transparency and narrative, understanding who we are as institutions, those are all things that are definitely hitting home. And again, I want to thank you so much for taking your time on your Tuesday evening to come on my show. And I'm going to wrap things up. I want to let our folks know what we'll be up to next week. Next week, we're going to be live from New York with a guest host, Chris Dorso, who you might have seen on our show before. He is going to announce the College by Storm application drive in the wake of Hurricane Sandy, and that's being coordinated by NACAC and its New York and New Jersey affiliates. So be sure to tune in next week. Thank you for tuning in tonight, and we will see you over at higheredlive.com.